Welcome to the Glass Lab podcast, where we talk all things product development. It's our goal every month to introduce you to the people, ideas, and development tools that are shaping the hardware products we all use every day. I'm Drew Westrick, your host, VP of Technology here at Glassboard. And today on the show, I've got with me Grant Chapman, our VP of Operations here at Glassboard. I've got Jenny Fisher, the Senior Innovation Guide at Roche, and also Ben Ettinger, who is our Senior Mechanical Engineer here at Glassboard. So welcome, everybody. Jenny, thanks so much for agreeing to be on today. Happy to have you here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Oh, it's just one of those worlds, those small worlds. So Ben, glad you were able to connect and bring everyone together.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I'm super curious in the job title because I think that's the most fascinating part I've heard so far. Can you explain what that is, an innovation guide? Because me being technical takes it one way, and I'm sure I'm completely wrong.
Yeah, sure. So we introduced the role of innovation guide about 3 years ago now. And 2 years ago, maybe. So our innovation team is really lean, and that was intentional with the mindset of innovation isn't one department's role, but it's everyone's role to contribute to innovation. So as an innovation guide, my role is to help inspire and drive internal bottom-up innovation as it aligns with our overall strategy. What this looks like involves kind of wearing many hats, but we work closely with our internal stakeholders to kind of create the innovation strategy. And from there, we roll out different workshops, host internal challenges, have different forums, kind of inspire that innovation. And then once we have internal ideas, we connect them with the appropriate tools to further advance those ideas. So I had somebody from an organization say, so you're kind of like an internal Sherpa. And so I'm really trying to get my title changed to Innovation Sherpa. So I think that's a lot cooler than guide.
So cool.
Innovation guide is not esoteric enough.
Yeah.
Sherpa.
Yeah. Fun fact, one of my favorite things is a Sherpa, like in the wintertime, like those, like pull over, like real fluffy things. So I think I could totally buy into that, only if I was allowed to wear that exclusively to work then.
Yeah, absolutely. But yeah, that's it. It's a pretty fluid role. I get to partake in a lot of things. I've really gotten to shape it along the way since I'm one of the first people to be in this role at my company.
Neat. And I'm kind of curious. So when you say innovation guide, is that limited to product innovation, process innovation, or is it pretty much just innovation really company wide? Is there, I guess, some guardrails put on that, or is it sort of open?
Yeah, I would say it's mostly about feeding our pipeline, so product. However, with that can come some, say, process innovation as we've introduced new methodologies like lean innovation, running design thinking workshops, anything that we think might be a trigger for creativity or ideas or something that could help us flesh out an idea. I would consider that more innovation that benefits us internally, but isn't an output to our customers.
Gotcha. Neat.
And the biggest question I've got is I hear these innovation workshops and things like that. Are those starting with a prompt that is a problem your company's trying to solve and already has identified that, hey, we want a new market or product in this market, or this is the problem we're trying to solve, we just don't know how or what to do about it? Or is this truly blue sky, hey, in the room, raise your hand if you've got a medical problem you'd like to see fixed, and how could we all come up with how open-ended are these workshops? And because our clients at Glassboard always come to us with either the problem defined or an idea of how they want to solve it. So we get what I say a little bit later in the process is where we pick it up. So I'd love to hear how you guys start at ground zero.
Yeah, so I think first and foremost, I work in our diabetes care division at Roche. So that's I'll say our scope, if you will. We have a great internal strategic insights team that has created just a bunch of artifacts or tools that we use that are representative of our customers. This can be people with diabetes, healthcare providers, payers, and this information kind of serves as initial fuel to inspire, say, a workshop. Maybe we'll step back and start a little bigger and say, hey, can we focus on this particular diabetes comorbidity? So that's one way we approach it. So it is kind of defined by the space. We also, being that I sit in R&D, will have people come forward with ideas that are maybe more technically focused. So say they work in a certain department and, they're really versed in a certain technology or a methodology or just have something they want to explore. We also nurture that as well, recognizing that maybe it doesn't initially align to a customer need, but it could be an enabling technology that will be important down the road.
Very cool. Very cool.
Who would be those initial stakeholders in like the early conversations? Is that marketing, user research? Is it primarily engineers, or what's the makeup of those conversations?
Yeah, I would say it depends. We work very closely with our internal marketing colleagues to help kind of shape out that initial strategy. And then from there, depending on what type of idea we're talking about, is it something where it's more of a concept and we're starting to define not only a potential solution, but a business model around that would definitely involve more of a commercial collaboration. Yeah. But if we are talking about those really early tech ideas, then the stakeholders are normally our internal R&D leadership team.
Okay.
As they're the ones that are kind of also driving the budget to fund these
Right.
opportunities.
No, that's cool. And that's what the next thing I was going to ask is, so you got this great idea, you host a workshop, and you have 5 ways to approach it. How do you guys decide which one to follow, like to chase and to tackle? And how do you acquire funding within the business to do that, to follow on? Not just the funding in like dollars, but in the human capital, right? So Jim is on the team that had this great idea, but he's also working on other program. Does he get to be involved in this development? How do you blend that into what I'll call his day job, right? If he's working on another program that's in active development, how do you guys deal with that split role?
Yeah, that's a good question. And that's when we shaped our innovation team as it is now. That was one of the big questions that we had to answer because it's something that comes up often. So I would say we've formatted our budgeting so that Jim can work on this project.
Right.
Now, in terms of the time and allocation, that's where it gets either Jim or Jim's manager gives kind of input to say, hey, Jim can do this. Still working on it, but
Right.
That's something that we've worked to that mindset of, hey, everyone contributes to innovation. And especially if it's somebody that it was their idea, we want them to be a part of it. And the organization, the people leaders, they're supportive of that. Obviously, if Jim, using Jim here,
Yeah.
if he's working on something really
Mission critical, right?
Yeah, then there might be some kind of balancing act there. But the overall, I would say, support is given for those individuals to participate in innovation as they'd like to.
No, that's super cool. I think that's one of the things we fight with or struggle with or like deal with at Glassport as well, is we very rarely have clients that will come in and want an entire engineer's worth of time in one discipline on their program. So we've got guys that are split between 2 programs or maybe between 3 smaller ones. And, how do you balance that clutch in, clutch out, and who's doing what when? And I think that's one of the bigger challenges of what we do as engineers, Ben, right? Is like, how do you determine when to work on what in a way that's efficient? Because that clutch in and clutch out is the worst part of what we do, I think, right? I would love nothing more than to be able to focus on this thing this week, this thing the next week, but the world doesn't work that way. So I think that's
Right.
Curious to see how you guys tackle that from, we're a super tiny team versus you guys are a very large corporation that does lots of process and lots of things. And I'd love to see how you approach it, because either one of us might have good points that the other one has never had visibility into.
And I think that also shows sort of like the value of prioritizing and like focusing on innovation and actually like putting people in that role, right? Because I think a lot of people think, oh, like innovation is just this purely organic thing, right? Where it just sort of like percolates up in an organization and magically, becomes the next generation of products. And while I do think it's difficult to just manufacture blind innovation, I do think you can definitely like foster it, right? And so that's even something like at Glassport we've toyed with over the years on different like projects or supporting things that maybe even isn't necessarily for a specific client's program or project, but just even like internal tools too, right? And I think that's kind of neat that you sit in this role within the organization and that your organization is actually prioritizing the ability to like let people innovate and say this actually is important, right? And like, again, to take your example, even if Jim is working on something important for the products of today, that you're also prioritizing some of that time for the products of like tomorrow and creating space for that innovation like to exist, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And you touched on, you made me think of something. I like to look at innovation as, when you think of health, we have our balanced diet, if you will, and we
Sure.
don't eat dessert all the time, but you need to have dessert. You need to have those treats and those
Yeah.
rewards. And innovation, I look at as health. You need to maybe take a break from your day-to-day job and get to work on something cool.
Right.
You also mentioned the value that it can add to an organization is it could serve as a continuing education opportunity for an employee to get to try something new, to flex a different muscle.
Yeah. I almost think of it sometimes as like exploration, right? And I think even if you think back to, even like I think like to childhood, for instance, right? I know we talked at the beginning of the show about, raising kids and all that, but I look in a way, it's like sometimes I feel like once you've been within an organization for so long, it's just, kind of a rinse repeat type thing where it's like, okay, come in, do my role. There's always, the to-do list is always getting longer and longer, but I think it's really cool when you value innovation and then you approach somebody and say, hey, we're going to pull you into this workshop. We're going to let you think creatively and kind of explore some different ideas. And then even outside of that, we're actually going to give you some time to just work on those things. And maybe nothing comes of it, right? And I think you can't look at that as like a failure, a negative that like, innovation didn't happen at this exact juncture, because sometimes all it takes is letting people explore and be creative and kind of get outside of their, what I'll call like normal daily grind or bubble, to maybe have some ideas that can then start to take place, right? And sometimes it could even help stuff that they're working on today, and maybe it's not even this huge aha moment, but it's just enough to be, feel kind of reinvigorated about what they are working on.
Yeah, absolutely. It's always fun when I'm a big fan of biomimicry, getting to learn, connect the dots from other experiences or other industries. And it is cool when people have those aha moments. And to your point of people that have maybe worked at the company for a really long time, it has been one thing that's been really rewarding in this role are those people that they'll reach out afterwards and they're like, you've just really reinvigorated me. Like, I feel inspired, that was so fun. And to me, that's a win right there.
No, absolutely.
That's awesome. That reminds me, have you seen the movie General Magic by chance?
No.
You should watch it. It's my favorite like innovation movie. It's about the guys that like invented the smartphone before the smartphone and like how it flopped. But all those people that are part of the team are now the CEOs of these major tech companies, and every one on the team was that A caliber, and they had all these A ideas, but the tech just wasn't there yet. And I think it's one of those things where the failure actually led to a bunch more successes than that one success would have been. And that's what just spurred that memory. And also for anyone watching, General Magic, if you're an engineer, development, new product, just watch it.
Check it out. Thank you.
It is inspiring.
10 out of 10 on Nerd Rotten Tomatoes, right?
Oh, yeah. Nerd Rotten Tomatoes 10 out of 10. And like at least 3 serotonin molecules will be made in your brain. I promise. It's the good feels. But I think that's the cool part about development. And Ben, you and I run through this all the time with the fight between like organic or constructed development of how to solve a problem. I think you and I fight like constructively on like, how are we going to approach this problem that we have? And it sounds like you guys just make time for it to be organic, which like you structure time and then light the fuse and run away and see what happens, which is really neat.
Yeah. And that structure piece is something that your guys' gym analogy reminded me of, which is just kind of the way that we think about constraints. I know part of your role is developing strategies for like early ideation. And I think sometimes if you just get people in a room and it's totally blue skies and no rails, right, then kind of the human nature is to take the path of least resistance to the solution. And I think one of the things that, at least for us, drives a lot of that creativity are the constraints. If you just say, design me this widget, okay, that's one thing. But then if you say, design me this widget that has to cost this much when it's done, and you only have this much money to develop it, and oh, by the way, it needs to be tailored to these types of people, suddenly we look at each other and go, oh man, we have to get creative to do that, right?
Right.
What are things like that you've identified for early ideation strategies?
I mean, in terms of constraint?
I guess constraints kind of what we do internally. Right.
And that's actually the question is like, how much and how do you give these guys rails?
Yeah. There's definitely constraints. Normally, time, you touched on that. We're sticking with Jim here. But if Jim only has so much time, that's obviously a constraint. Budget is a constraint. When we're talking about these technical innovations, we've moved more to the model or emphasizing, do something, show some evidence, get more funding, advancing that way.
The continual unlock method, right?
Yes.
Like get to the thing you told me you're going to get to, or maybe 3 steps behind it, but I'll tell you have to get all the way there. and then we'll decide if we get the next round of
Right.
funding or not, right?
Yeah. And then also I've mentioned collaborating with our commercial stakeholders. We also have rolled out the lean innovation methodology, which heavily relies on the lean business canvas. And so that is a great tool right there to identify what could be constraints, either market size, channels, all those kind of key components. But that brings a little more of the commercial constraints to it. But we definitely want to work as a team, because these tools, the lean business canvas, this kind of internal constraining, they're all set up to align with our internal end-to-end process.
Neat.
That's super cool.
I know we've talked a lot about sort of like the mechanics of the innovation, but I guess just industry wide right now, I mean, what do you see as being like where most of the innovation is happening, at least right now?
Yeah, good question. So I think we all know COVID shaking up everything.
Sure, yeah.
But especially in the healthcare space, we're seeing, you might see companies that are coming in that weren't there 5 or 10 years ago, maybe looking at like Google or Amazon. And also you're seeing a lot of partnerships emerge, especially if you're talking about a space like diabetes. There's so many complexities to diabetes, surrounding comorbidities. For one company to do it all, they could, maybe large companies can do it all, but it's kind of silly when you look at companies that are already developing expertises in certain areas, bigger companies or even startups that are emerging, what's going on in academia.
Yeah. So when you talk about comorbidities, are you talking really about like holistic care then, like not just treating, I guess, diabetes specifically, but maybe all the things that play into that in terms of maybe it's, diet or weight or other like factors that can either make diabetes like better or worse. Is that what you're talking about, I guess? Okay,
yeah.
got it.
Where the holistic care,
Yeah.
anything under the, could be like a chronic health condition.
Right.
See, and I think that's at least like I don't have diabetes, but at least from a healthcare perspective, I do find some of the things that are interesting. Stuff like the fitness trackers, the watches. Even like with like Apple and Google now having health apps where you can kind of like pull together maybe a bunch of different data, or even as like a patient like looking at your healthcare metrics like more often, or being like more aware sort of holistically of like where you're at. Again, sometimes it'll tell you, your estimated maybe like VO2 max, right? And, as somebody that's maybe like not an athlete, you're like, well, why would that matter? But then the more you kind of read up on that and realize like, oh, that, kind of tells you a little bit about your cardiovascular health. Again, I feel like the more you can educate people about their health and maybe some of those like metrics and sort of like where they're at holistically from a healthcare standpoint, the more they can kind of work on all of those things, right? So I'm sure you guys are playing in that space, but it just seems like there's lots of connectedness and apps and even like patient data now that maybe only your doctor would know or see that. But now, you can be more cognizant of that. Like I think one of the neatest things, like when I get like blood work now is, I get an email from my doctor that sort of like shows me all the stats and whether or not they're like in a good or a bad range. And I mean, I'm an engineer, so I'm like a nerd and I really like data, but even I think for an average patient, I think being able to like see that and go back and access that sort of like whenever you want is sort of powerful. Cause I feel like normally it would just have been you order blood work, your doctor says, oh yeah, most of your levels look good, or you have these 3 or 4 levels that maybe don't look so good. And 3 weeks later, you kind of just like forget about it, and being able to like go back and reaccess that data or sort of see how those numbers are changing over time. Like those are all things that I'm just thinking of. It's just really kind of neat and being enabled at really a pretty like rapid pace right now. I feel like industry wide.
Yeah, I agree. I think the thing that excites me the most is that personalization that you kind of touched upon. And, when we look at medicine in general and the models, the kind of traditional models, most of them being shaped around male, we see new companies coming out looking at, hey, what about females? We're 50% of the population. But then also just in general, what if I don't fit into one of those models?
Right.
When we're talking about any space, we all have unique complexities that we deal with. And so for someone to have that data to find what's right for them, either in managing a condition or just their general lifestyle, that's pretty empowering. And I also, being a new mom, I get excited about kids now being raised with this technology. I hope it really does just become the norm that what's ahaing us now is, oh, I can have all this data on my wrist. They're just like, yeah, that's how it's always been. And hopefully it's going to lead to healthier generations.
Yeah.
And I love the gamification, right? Like I'm an engineer. I love numbers and math and things like that. But the like red, yellow, green, or like frowny face, smiley face scale on like your numbers is amazing for people that don't do numbers well, right?
Yeah.
Like even people that don't do graphs well. Just where am I? Good, bad? Where's my Caesar thumb that we always say in engineering? Is it good or bad? But like just having a gut feel of like, oh, I'm actually really bad, or I'm really good here. That's great. And like getting that reward for like if you change one of your numbers. My dad was fighting his cholesterol for a long time, and like he got pretty gamification into the like what aspects of my life give me the biggest bang for my buck.
Yeah.
Right? Can I eat that piece of red meat if I also go like ride my bike and do this thing?
Yeah, I think the trend that I'm seeing from a patient perspective is this unwillingness to accept like a one size fits all model,
yeah.
right? Like I think that a statistic I had read was in the next 3 years, humanity will come up with more data than we had in the 30 years previous.
Yep.
So the problem will not be like access to data, or it won't be the data itself, maybe access to it.
Or the right filter.
The way to parse it, right? And I had a similar experience, Drew, you're talking about blood work, where I had a blood panel done, and I basically just got the very generic, like, oh, you may want to try a Mediterranean diet to get these things. And I was like, hey, doc, no, I want to know the number. Like, give me the sheet. Like, there's an app somewhere that I can parse this data with and make heads or tails of it. So I see that trend where it's, personalized care and wanting a tailored solution for the individual.
Specifics, even I think to diabetes. I mean, I've seen there's like a lot of the measurement tools are becoming more like automated, right? Where instead of pricking your finger and taking a measurement, several times a day, you can wear a sensor. It's wireless, or you can tap on it with your phone, things like that. I mean, obviously that's happening now. I'm assuming you're going to continue to see that sort of innovations continue to accelerate, I would imagine, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing that's really cool about the diabetes, I'll say community, you might have heard of the tagline, "We are not waiting." A group of people with type 1 diabetes or parents of children with type 1 diabetes created this internal DIY movement, have actually inspired a lot of innovation that we're seeing in the diabetes arena. So I hope that DIY movement within diabetes also just inspires other industries as well in terms of what could be in terms of health innovation.
That's neat. Like, can you just give us an example of like maybe something that they've come up with that you feel like is like, moving the needle, at least for companies that exist in that space?
Yeah, you might have heard of the automated insulin delivery, or some people might refer to it as the artificial pancreas. That was something that was kind of put together by this group of people. They, one of the pioneers, he came from the control systems industry, I think working in oil. And he was like, we can connect these huge oil refineries all around the world. I can see all of this data from across the world right here on my screen, but I can't see the data coming in from my son's insulin pump or his CGM. So doing pioneer work in there and bringing that data together, how do we get those devices to potentially talk to ultimately bring true relief to patients, to not have to think about their diabetes? I saw something just last week. I think the average person with diabetes on insulin spends 1 to 2 hours a day having to think and manage their diabetes.
Yep.
That's
And
a
it
lot of
all adds
time.
up. It's all 2 to 5 minutes at a time, but that adds up throughout a whole day.
Right.
And that's day after day, week after week, right?
Exactly. And even maybe the subconscious burden of, oh shoot, did I do that 2 to 5 minutes ago?
Right. And
what did I do at 8
or
a.m.?
Should I eat that, or is that
Right.
going to cause me a problem? Right. That subconscious of like always having to monitor that.
Yeah,
where for the rest of us we
absolutely.
take for granted that.
Right.
That's
My
what
wife calls it the mental load, right?
Yep.
It's a big term that they
Yes.
use, especially with mothers, right? It's just this like constant like thinking about the next thing. Is the laundry done? Like all of that. I think that can apply though really even to like patients, right? And just constantly having that mental load of where am I at? When is my next meal? Where's my insulin level now? Where's it going to be in an hour? Depending upon what I eat or drink or what I do or don't do, right?
Right.
So again, I think I would love to see more, like you said, community-based things, like predictive things, just even like the ability for people to sort of like share their experiences. Because again, I think when you look at individualized care, I think it's always a question too of like, well, if what I'm doing is working, may not always work for everybody, but other people I think can have value when they sort of see what other people are doing and it's working or not working, and just being able to share that, right? I mean, I know that with healthcare data, you have to be careful, right? I mean, there's laws that govern a lot of this, but at the same time, I do think there's some value, at least holistically, in being able to, say whether this, specific action, right, is helping or hurting, or, what direction it's going, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the connectedness and the community you mentioned, that's it's so much more than even just say medical advice, but just feeling like you're not alone, especially if maybe you're the only person in your family or your immediate friend group that might have diabetes or any condition for that matter. In that same article that I just referenced, I think it mentioned over 90% of people will get their diabetes advice from community.
Yeah.
Yep.
So just to put that value to that there.
Yeah. No, and I think that one of the things for me is like a product development engineer that makes a huge ring there for me is like, I need a data set because I don't have diabetes. So I have no idea what the pain point is or what the small anecdotal detail is that would spring the, oh, that's what's a pain? Oh, that's a problem we can solve. But if I didn't
Yeah.
experience that, it's really hard to come up with the fix.
Yeah.
And Ben, you and I have been on a number of programs where we aren't the intended customer of a product, and it's really hard for us to like, you have to put yourself in their shoes, but if you don't have enough data to draw yourself a pair of shoes to slip on,
Right.
you're trying to solve a problem that you don't know why it hurts, right?
Yeah.
I think that's the important part in like any product development story is the voice of that customer has to be loud. It has to be accurate.
Oh, yeah.
And you want the weird cases. You want that corner case to be heard because it might spark something that everyone else just takes for granted. Yeah, that's what sucks about it, but we don't need to complain about that. I want
Yeah.
this other part fixed, but that part might be the easy one to fix, right? The low-hanging fruit.
Totally. Yeah, I feel like that's the soft side of what we do that makes what we do so much different than a traditional nuts and bolts engineer, right? Is like we have to be able to solve the technical problem, but we have to be able to identify the human problem,
Yeah.
right?
You have to crack the nut of like,
And-
what do you feel?
Right. And I think that's somewhat non-traditional for an engineering path. And I feel like you deal with that a lot as well. Did you anticipate getting into that realm? When you were studying engineering, did you think you were going to a more technical nuts and bolts path and that just happened about?
And maybe give us just a quick brief of your background, right? I don't think
yeah,
Grant and I
sure.
know, and as well as the listeners, but yeah, that might
Yeah,
help.
sure. So I went to school for biomedical engineering. To your question, Ben, why biomedical engineering? Initially, I was really interested in prosthetics. But I think there was always that underlying human component to it, or I'll just say creature component because I was really into animal prosthetics. But I did have a professor. She mentioned that a lot of BME students tend to have that more altruistic, or that's kind of why they get into BME and that wanting to help others. Then my path to Roche came about when I got an internship opportunity, not in prosthetics, but hey, Roche was a good company. I'll check it out. And then here I am, X amount of years later. So it just kind of, I still have that interest, but I'm not working in it now. But I think to the question, the underlying focus on people is still there. I never saw myself really getting into the pure just technical nuts and bolts. So when I came to Roche, I came in through our requirements engineering, which is more about that initial, elicitation analysis of the business and then the technical requirements and how do we feed those into more of the specifications down the road. So there was always that more, I'll say, soft skill side to it. So for me, now then getting here as an innovation guide and getting to connect people with those opportunities to talk to our customers, that kind of all just, I'll say, fell into place naturally.
That's
super
a
cool.
great story. That's awesome.
Yeah, and that is something that going back to when you asked, what do I do? One thing, so my customer in part is the R&D organization. And we hear that all the time. Like, we want to get in front of customers. So we've organized, in addition to our workshops, we've put together kind of these different, we call it the Innovation Impulse. It's a suite of offerings that aim to kind of inspire, educate, trigger innovation. And one thing we have is called EMC squared, engineer meets customer and customer care. And this is really just a day where our employees can come and they can meet people that fall under the customer, or when we say customer care, it could be an HCP. But to your point, there really is something so special about getting to sit down and talk to somebody face to face and hear about whatever their little quirk is, or even just to hear it. And then you're like, okay, the research I just read is true.
This is validating.
Or that thing that I've been working on does solve a problem that someone really has.
Right.
Like, and this is where it will make their life better, which makes all the rewarding, right?
We in our last one we did 2 years ago, COVID's kind of put a damper in wanting to have this face-to-face event, but we heard from a diabetes nurse educator that she's so busy every day that if a solution is too difficult to train a patient on, she won't put it in front of the patient. And that was pretty aha for a group of engineers when we're thinking about features to add, or even from a user experience perspective. It all kind of ties together. I mean, she just told us, it could be the greatest thing in the world, but if it's too hard to train somebody on in this 10 minutes I have with them, sorry, I'm going to the next thing.
Right. And I think that's so important to like have engineers be able to experience like how a customer interacts with the product and actually like see that. Because again, I think we can kind of get lost in this world of, at least I think of it this way, that like most engineers work on things, right? And then there's a whole class of people that sort of like work and design things for people. But it's like, it's really important, I think, to like bridge that divide, right? Because again, I mean, even from an educational background, it's like a lot of what you do in college and beyond, right? A lot of it is the math, the things like, again, it's all focused on the engineering that is very like thing oriented. But the thing about engineering is, you know, for the most part, the things that you're designing are going to be interacted with by people, right? And I think sometimes we can sort of like lose sight of that. And again, I think in some contexts it makes sense, right? But like people tend to like hide the engineers in the back of the building, right? But sometimes you got to like get them out in the world and get them in front of customers and get that exposure to how people are actually going to interact with the end product. Because I know that at least in the instances where I have been able to do that, the more I see people use the product or understand how they interact with it, the more you start to think about that when you actually are thinking about engineering the product, right? So I really do think that's an important feedback loop that sometimes maybe gets missed. And maybe not just missed, but it gets hidden behind layers, right? Like maybe there's a customer service person that relays something to the project manager, and the project manager, relays it on to the engineering manager. And by the time it gets all the way back to the engineer, maybe you've kind of lost what the end customer's actual pain point or issue was, and maybe the solution doesn't, really get solved, right?
There's so much nuance there, right?
Yeah.
Like the telephone game doesn't work, right?
Yeah, and I was in a training last week through Lead Stack. So within my role as an innovation guide, I'm a lean innovation coach in our organization. And we were talking about, when we talk about pain points, also kind of customer needs. And so there's these functional needs, and there's also emotional needs. And I think getting to talk to customers, you're going to get more of those emotional needs than are articulated, say, in a requirements document.
Right. Yep.
I think a common theme on this podcast we talk about is the tools of product development, right? And so we talk literal equipment, CNC machines, 3D printers. We'll talk kind of the more intellectual pursuit. How do you parse the simulation results? But one thing we haven't really touched on yet in the podcast is that emotional intelligence piece, which is so critical to your point, Drew. I mean, most products are the end user is a human, right? And it's going to be interacted with on some level, and how it's interacted with kind of dictates its functionality.
For sure. Yep. And exactly like you said, even if the innovation exists or the product can do what is best, for instance, for a patient, but the patient can't get it to do that thing, or they can't interact with it in a way, or even aren't even trained to use the tool in that way, then does it even matter that item can do whatever it is it can do, right? If it actually can't be unlocked or done by the end user, or the end user can be trained to do it, then it's almost like it doesn't exist, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. sorry to
No,
interrupt you
you
there.
go first.
You made me think, though, when we talk about how COVID has shaken up different industries, I think it's brought a lot of attention to the topic of health equity. And so we could design really cool solutions, but if people can't afford them or they can't access them, that's a problem.
Yep.
And so that's something else that we've been looking at Roche is, how do we use our position as a large company, not only in the globe, but in the communities that we have locations in, like Indianapolis here, to create these programs to help get access to our solutions, to help people get educated on them. So that's something that's really inspiring, and it's cool to see different companies giving the focus to this very important topic. Because when we also talk about our customers, it's great to get to sit down with one person and learn from them. But they're one in how many of unique seas of people that we might not get the opportunity to talk to.
Right. No, and it's always hard to justify we interviewed 10 people and 8 of them said this, but 2 of them said this other thing. How, what data set is enough, and how do you parse that and read that is always the challenge, right? Will all the clients feel this way, or just the ones we interviewed happen to feel that way this time?
Right. Do you have any like boots on the ground strategy for how you would tackle that problem up front? Like, we want a representative sample of who this end user might be. That very first step of identifying who. Do you guys have a kind of boots on the ground strategy for it?
Yeah, so I think it depends. When we're talking about our more like strategic insights research, there are very thorough upfront screeners that are created to ensure we're getting a sample that represents the population that we want to go after. When we're talking about like an innovation event, our last one we partnered with the JDRF, which is Juvenile Diabetes and Research Foundation. We reached out to them. They sent a call asking for volunteers to come. And so for that one, it was more, we kind of had an idea of who might come based on their audience.
Right.
But that one's just, I'll say, is more for the fun exercise. So I think it depends on the intent of what we want that research for. But I did recently learn if you have if you get a good sample size and you have a good qualitative researcher, you should be information should start becoming repetitive after 5 people.
Got it.
Interesting.
That's a great number to know.
Yeah. And it's kind of
Predicates.
nice that it's pretty low, right?
Yeah, just predicates that you have a good researcher. So
Yeah.
we'll see how that turns out for us, Ben. And so we've talked about the customer and how hard it is to parse their data. And one of the things I'm dying to find out, because we're a hardware podcast and I'm a hardware guy, is so you have an idea and you guys internally okay, yeah, this is cool. What tools do you guys use internally to try? Right? Like what do you guys have in your business to allow people to play and prototype or test or go from there? Or do you have a team that you feed the idea to them and then they prototype it and bring it back to the guy that had the idea? Like, how does that whole maker side of it work, right? Where people have to make a physical good.
Yeah, good question. So I think it kind of depends on the idea, but I would say within our different teams, say if we're talking about chemistry, if we're talking about mechanical engineering, they all have their respective tools. Mechanical engineering, they might have a 3D printer. In chemistry, they might have a mass spectrometer. So depending on whatever tools they kind of have internally, they might drive that. But we do also work with external partners for certain types of prototyping, depending on what the idea might be.
Yep, very cool. Yeah, I was just curious, how much you guys in the innovation suite, like in your direct department, like had this tool that you loaned out for quick prototype or things like that to a team that needed it, or if you just borrowed what was already in the business, or did you go outside, right? Because there's so many different ways to skin that.
Yeah,
right?
Absolutely. And I think one thing that we've also been trying to introduce with some of our, say, looking at the lean methodology, but what is the most amount of evidence you can collect without having to build something out?
Got
So
it.
for some of those things we talked about, if say we're talking about the ME team and they already have this tool, it might just be easy for them to go in the lab and whip something up, if
Right.
you will. But if we're talking about something where it's really expensive, it's like, okay, well, maybe we can take a step back and look at what information do we already have access to? Are there publications? But what kind of evidence can we first say, hey, there's a signal here that we should spend X amount of dollars
Right.
to get to build something out?
Because that follows up the exact next question I had, which is, okay, so you do things where they unlock money as they go, and you try and gather evidence really, really early. What are your phase gates? What do these look like? From a high level, is there like an, initial idea, alpha, beta, release, where your, initial idea that's just on paper, here's a research paper, here's an idea, we think this has got merit, we vote on it, yes, we fund that one. the alpha phase is, okay, we need a looks like prototype-ish that might have like one of the functions it needs, and beta is like it's got to be a fully fleshed out, working device, even though it might not be manufacturable. Things like that. What are your gates and phases, and how do you guys navigate that?
Yeah, good question. So I would say when we're talking about something that we've identified as a solution that we're really going to explore, flesh out, commercialize, we have an end-to-end process that has its own set of deliverables that are mostly, I'll say, more commercial pieces, but do follow some kind of technical readiness level. And then pre that, in our early innovation, we heavily rely on technical readiness levels to kind of guide but the what's next or what do we spend on. But I would also say there's that element of what ideas, if there's something that we can immediately see, hey, this aligns with our organizational strategy, it could feed into a current platform or a current product, maybe that, that's going to get streamed faster.
Yeah, basically right into let's engineer it, make it work, because we know it meets the need that we have.
Exactly.
Right.
If we're talking about something where it's like, okay, we're getting some signals, but it's still pretty exploratory, then it kind of depends.
Yeah,
I'll say.
and so it sounds like it's a huge amount of analog variableness, right? Like you can go full throttle on something or baby steps at a time. And my next question is, and I won't ask like number quantification for dollars, but how much time do you guys spend between, next approval? Is this like a quick 6-8 week thing, or is this like in 6 months we'll come back with enough data to get to the next phase? How much time is there between your gates and your innovation stuff internally, right? Because I think there's that split log of either really, really fast, but then do you have enough time to truly flesh it out before you get to your next gate, or too long, do you go too far down a rabbit hole that wasn't worth going down, right? So how do you guys draw that line?
Yeah, I think we're still learning that
So
one
are we.
there. We've put in different programs into place to make things go faster. I'll say on the business model validation side, on the technical side, there's just a lot of factors there. Going back to Jim, what's Jim working on? What are budget constraints that we'll have into place? But still exploring kind of a true model that we could make our own to get that speed.
Yeah, no, and it's tough. I think that balance between like when you call a prototype good enough is really tough. But for like, all right, yes, this is it. Let's really engineer it now, not quit prototyping, and let's go for it.
Yeah. Well, I think that's the comment of how much evidence can you get before you build something is interesting, because I think with physical product development, a lot of our ethos is build early, build often. But we've mentioned the pandemic a couple of times, and that has shaken things up a little bit. We're working on a medical device this past year that was a digital physical product where, it's at-home trials now because of the pandemic, and we're looking at different ways to prototype and get validation. And one of the things we did was a web-based prototype for some user feedback early and often. That's something we probably wouldn't have thought to do before the pandemic, but something that will stick going forward. And it was a way to get 90% of the data we would have with 20% of the effort, right?
I wouldn't say 20. It was far less, but it was one of those things where you don't have to ship your physical product. Just, hey, does this user interface meet your needs? Does this look nice? Do you like the way this text reads? Do you like the options the user gets? And then you both get our stakeholder, like our client, goes through it and gives his stuff, but he can then very easily send that to his potential customers and say, is this visually appealing, and get that warm fuzzies on it, not even from the technical, or does it meet the need?
Right.
Which is huge.
Have you all experienced anything through the pandemic like that that's like, oh, we would never have done that, but it's going to stick going forward?
Yeah, I know in our human factors team, they've had a lot of, I'll say, process innovation, recognizing like, hey, maybe we don't need to fly to a study site and do certain things. We can do it digitally like that.
Right.
And then also we have taken advantage of some of these digital tools where you can meet people, I'll say meet people in the wild. One thing that's nice about it is you could, it's not just people in your own backyard or wherever your research facility is, but it could be people across the globe. And then I really think there's something underappreciated about that element of somebody getting to be in their own comfort zone, giving you that feedback, maybe not getting stressed out about getting stuck in traffic, I'm in this strange place, they're sitting at home getting to give you that feedback. And, is there something there? I don't know, but I'd like to think there is.
Yeah, you get them as they are, right? Yeah, that makes sense.
No, that's super neat. I think it's been really fantastic to just learn a whole lot more about innovation. Again, I think particularly innovation sort of, in a unique industry, right? Again, I look at it at the end of the day, obviously, so much of what you do is people-centric, right? So I think that really is just neat to see how innovation takes place when it relates to patients and their care and stuff that really is like deeply personal. So I know I definitely enjoyed listening to all the different things you had to say today, and it's been just really neat.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. It's been great to sit down with you three.
Yep. Thank you.
Thanks for coming in. Take
Yeah,
care, guys.
thank you.